Today in the spotlight is the decision of the rating agency S&P Global, which has once again confirmed the United States of America's AA+ credit rating with a stable outlook. At first glance, this might seem like dry financial statistics, but behind this event lies a deep story about the balance between economic growth, fiscal risks, political decisions, and international relations. So what happened? On August 19, 2025, S&P Global released an updated report stating that despite a wave of trade tensions triggered by Donald Trump's reinstatement of tariff policies, the U.S. is maintaining a high credit rating. This is a very notable moment because just a few months earlier, another major agency, Moody's, had gone in the opposite direction and downgraded the U.S. rating, citing the rising budget deficit and enormous national debt as reasons. Let's dive a little deeper. What exactly is a country's credit rating? It's an assessment of its ability to service debt. In other words, to pay interest and repay borrowed funds. The higher the rating, the lower the cost of borrowing for the government and companies within that country. When a country has a high rating, its bonds are considered reliable, investors are more willing to invest, and interest rates are lower. Therefore, any change in the rating sends a signal to global markets about whether the U.S. economy can be trusted in the long run or not. Now the most interesting part. Why exactly now, when the U.S. budget deficit remains high, did S&P decide not to downgrade but rather to reaffirm the rating? The report mentions that the key factor was tariff revenue. Over the past few months, after the Trump administration announced the return and expansion of tariffs on a wide range of imported goods, the federal budget of the United States received an additional flow of money. For example, in July alone, customs revenues increased by $21 billion, and for the second quarter of 2025, the total amount was almost $50 billion. These are significant figures that have partially offset the costs associated with a new large-scale bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed by Trump in July. This bill combines several contradictory measures. On one hand, it provides tax cuts for businesses and individuals, and on the other, it increases government spending on infrastructure, defense, and social programs. Economists criticized it for potentially inflating the deficit even more, yet the unexpected lifeline turned out to be the tariffs. The money the U.S. collects from foreign trade began to flow into the Treasury at record rates. Part 3. However, there's also the flip side of the coin. On the one hand, tariffs fill the budget, but on the other hand, they inevitably impact the economy. They raise import prices, provoke retaliatory measures from other countries, and can lead to trade wars. We're already seeing signs of escalating tensions with Brazil, Canada, and the European Union. For consumers, this means higher prices on certain goods, from electronics to food. For companies, especially those reliant on imported components, it means higher production costs and pressure on profit margins. The big question is, can such a tariff policy be a sustainable source of budget revenue? Economists are divided. Some believe that the U.S. has a strong enough internal economy to withstand the extra load and even attract manufacturing back home. Others warn that in the long run, trade partners won't tolerate constant pressure and will start looking for alternative markets. This means that some export opportunities for American companies might be lost. It's also interesting to see how this decision ties into the country's debt metrics. The U.S. national debt has already surpassed $34 trillion, and the budget deficit in 2024 was about 7.5% of GDP. S&P projects that in the coming years, the deficit will decrease to around 6% of GDP, but even that remains a very high level for an advanced economy. At the same time, S&P emphasizes the resilience of monetary policy. The Federal Reserve, despite all the challenges, is showing it can keep inflation under control and ensure predictable monetary conditions. Now we come to the political context. For Donald Trump, tariffs are not just an economic tool. They're also a political signal. He actively promotes the idea of economic nationalism, declaring that the U.S. will no longer sacrifice its interests for globalism. For his supporters, tariffs symbolize the protection of American jobs and industry, even if it means higher prices. In this way, tariff policy becomes not just an economic, but also a socio-psychological tool. It reinforces Trump's image as a leader who is taking back control for America. If we look at the international level, the S&P decision also carries symbolic weight. It shows that despite political frictions and fiscal challenges, the U.S. economy is still seen as a reliable cornerstone of the global financial system. U.S. Treasury bonds remain a safe haven for investors, especially during periods of global turbulence. Even China, which is the largest holder of American debt, is not rushing to abandon them, recognizing that there's no comparable alternative of that scale. But there's an important detail. If Moody's and other agencies continue to downgrade the U.S., it could create a split in how the countries proceed. Some investors will follow S&P's view and maintain their confidence, while others may rely on more pessimistic forecasts from competitors. This could lead to increased market volatility and fluctuations in bond yields. On the one hand, the reaffirmation of the rating is a sign of stability. On the other hand, it's a warning signal that this stability is not based on structural reforms or spending cuts, but on a temporary measure, tariffs that could at any moment turn from a budgetary tool into a source of trade conflicts. And here's the main question. What will happen next? Several scenarios are possible. The first scenario is that the tariff strategy works, the budget gains more revenue, and the economy adapts to the new conditions. In that case, the U.S. can indeed stabilize its debt without drastic spending cuts. Part B. The second scenario is that the international community actively pushes back, imposes retaliatory tariffs, and as a result, U.S. budget revenues start to decline, putting domestic companies under pressure. The third scenario is a combination of the first two, a short-term benefit from tariffs that fades to 2 to 3 years, forcing the country to find new solutions. And that's the unique part of today's news, and reflects not only the current economic balance, but also the long-term strategy for the U.S. What's at stake is not just a rating, but trust in the American model as a whole, its resilience, and its ability to handle internal and external challenges.